Hello, and it's been a while. I think it was autumn with Harvest and Remembrance hymns was the last time that we came to you through the Organist Entertains. Apologies for the delay. Life has just simply caught up and not allowed much time for the Christmas edition which was promised and something at Easter too. However, there's plenty in the back catalogue that would suffice your Christmas and Easter musical desires. So this is the long-awaited return of the Organist Entertains, bringing to you, shall we say, the central chart countdown of hymns and music from weddings. So we're blessed to have not requests, but memories from weddings past and other musical pieces, whether that be hymns or incidental music, which wouldn't be out of place at a wedding. And of course, our opening music tonight was none other than the Bridal March. How many of you walked down an aisle to da 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 da? I've got a funny story. I remember playing at a wedding and the bride had chosen the Bridal March to enter the church. And every time she heard dum da da dum bum bum bum, she got cold feet. But after the third attempt, and the organ in that church was underneath the pulpit with a mirror across the top, so there was I peering at the back, watching for the minister, who after the first time, stop, second time, stop, third time, the bride came down the aisle. And afterwards, in speaking to the minister, what was going on? Was she having second thoughts? Was something up? No. Every time she heard da 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 da, she took cold feet. So on the third attempt, shall we say, the minister just gave her a gentle push down the aisle, and she walked down the aisle as if the first two attempts had never really happened. However, here comes the bride, the Bridal March. I am sure many of you have had for your entry on your big day. Now here we come to the countdown from Bellshill Central. And interspersed between some of these hymns will be some meanderings from me and some hymns which haven't been requested or asked for, but other hymns that may be wedding friendly. So we come to a selection of hymns, 7 of them, which have come in joint fourth. Now I didn't do first, third equal and 10th equal. We'll just have first, second, third and fourth, but there are lots tied. So we have, first of all, Bind Us Together, and that was a hymn which was sung at the wedding of Lynn and Alan Swan, and I'm sure has been sung at countless weddings up and down the land. Our next hymn in our joint fourth of 7 is All Things Bright and Beautiful. And that was sang at the wedding of Megan and John Fraser. In fact, here at Bellshill Central. And of course, All Things Bright and Beautiful talks about God's wonderful creation around about us. And when we think of that creation story, we're in the book of Genesis, and we're in the Garden of Eden. And after God has created the sky, the seas, the birds that fly around, the fish that swim in the tree, the plants, God created man. And God gave man Eve to go forth and multiply. So All Things Bright and Beautiful is a perfect hymn for weddings. All things bright and beautiful. Our next hymn, which is fourth equal, is a version of the 23rd Psalm. And this was sang at the wedding of Peggy and Neil Walker. And it's the hymn, The King of Love, My Shepherd Is. A beautiful tune, lovely words, and just a slight variation on a hymn which may or may not come higher up the countdown of Central's wedding hymns. next hymn tonight is the fourth of the fourth equal set. And it's words which come from Psalm 103 and could also be loosely linked to Psalm 148, where we give thanks and praise to God. And we also think about his wonderful creation. It is a hymn which was sang at the wedding of Ian and Margaret Douglas. And it is, of course, that stonker of a hymn, which it would actually be not a bad hymn for a bride to come down the aisle to. And it's Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven.
Our next hymn tonight is a hymn that was sang at the wedding of Janet and Joe Young. It's a hymn which we actually don't sing all that often these days. We perhaps might sing certain verses from it, or we sing a hymn which takes some verses from it, and it's a tune which I know I love to play, although the hymn book actually sets it in a different key. The key of A flat sits much better under the fingers. The tune is Belmont, and the words are by Cool Siloam. So it's a hymn which talks about the various facets of life. It talks about life and death, and it talks about new beginnings, and it also talks about children. So it's a hymn which, although we don't sing all that often these days, I can see fitting fairly well at a wedding ceremony. So from the wedding of Janet and Joe, we have By Cool Siloam. And our next hymn tonight, I feel as if I'm a broken record saying that, is a hymn that was sang at the wedding of Ian and Susan McLeish, right here in this very building. It's a hymn which we often sing in church, which is a wonderful way to begin a worship service, which reminds us to be still, for the presence of the Lord is here. We're then reminded about the glory of the Lord and the power of the Lord. And I suppose that is something that all married couples, all families and relationships, big and small, should remember at times, to be still, for the presence of the Lord is here.
So I've given the game away, I think, in this introduction. It is, of course, be still, for the presence of the Lord, the Holy One, is here. Now, our last hymn in this fourth equal set is a hymn which I personally have never played at a wedding. However, it's most appropriate. It was sang at the wedding of Sheena and John Bowman. And it's the hymn, All My Hope on God is Founded. And that's something which every new relationship in marriage should have at its heart, at its centre, that it will be built in hope and love and with God ever present. So we have the hymn, All My Hope on God is Founded, and what I have tried to do is use a hymn book which was around when the majority of these weddings took place, and it's CH3, the third edition of the church hymnary. In this particular version, I don't know if you can see that, but I got it in 1994. But it was first published, printed in 1973. And lots of these weddings took place in the early 70s, 80s and 90s, but some of them were a little bit earlier. I don't actually have a CH2 to hand. So All My Hope in God is Founded in this book is set to 2 tunes. The first of them, I have to say as an organist, it is a stonker of a tune, and it's the tune Michael, which was written in memory of Herbert Howell's son, if memory serves correctly, who was called Michael. And the other tune is Grosvenor, which is the one we tend to sing on a Sunday morning service. So Sheena, you're getting 2 for the price of 1 here. I'm going to play all the verses to the tune of Michael and then play a couple to the tune of Grosvenor. So I don't know what one you had on your wedding day, whether it was the first tune or the second tune. You can tell me later on. But for your wedding hymn, we have All My Hope on God is Founded.
we come to, I think, what would be our bronze medalist if this was the Olympics or a similar event. We now have 4 hymns that all scored the same. And what we're going to do is, we've said whose wedding that these hymns took place at, but as we get nearer the top 2 hymns, we have some more information about some of these weddings. So, in our bronze position, we have Love Divine, and that was sung at the wedding of Ian and Margaret Douglas, and that wedding took place on the 7th of August 1976 at Netherlee Parish Church on the south side of Glasgow, and conducting the wedding was the Reverend Duncan Shaw. Ian and Margaret tell us that Reverend Shaw was not the minister that was due to marry them. It was the Reverend Mayor, who sadly passed away a week before their wedding. So the assistant minister at Netherlee conducted their wedding. And Love Divine was also sang at the wedding of Drew and Jane Aitken, here in this building, but when it was known as the MacDonald Memorial Church, on the 22nd of March 1985. And conducting that service was the Reverend William Glencross. So here is the first of our bronze position hymns, Love Divine, All Loves Excelling. And I'm not sure whether we used Hyfrydol or Blenwern, so we have both. So everybody's going to enjoy 2 renditions of Love Divine. Now, the second of our bronze medalists was sang at the wedding of Lynn and Alan Swan on the 25th of June 1994 at Bellshill West Church. And that wedding was conducted by Mr. Seth. It was also sang at the wedding of Leanne and Craig Russell, here in this building, then known as Bellshill Central Parish Church, of Leanne and Craig Russell, can't remember if I said that, and conducting that wedding was the Reverend Kevin De Beer. And the hymn is a beautiful hymn, again talking about creation and mornings. And it's to the wonderful tune of Benесson. It is, of course, Morning Has Broken. Our third hymn in our bronze medalist section was sang at the wedding of Ian and Susan McLeish, here in Bellshill when we were known as MacDonald Memorial, and that wedding was conducted by the Reverend Jim Zambanini. It was also the hymn was sung at the wedding of Leanne and Craig, whom we've just heard about. And it's a hymn which I used to play in a church on the south side of Glasgow that had lots of weddings. And when we had the chat with the bride and groom, you quickly figured out whether it was a church wedding or it was a wedding held in the church, but the people that were coming weren't church attenders. And I used to say to the couples, don't listen to your mum and your dad, or your granny, your grandpa, your aunties or uncles, or even sometimes the minister. You want your friends and family coming to your service and being able to participate in the special occasion and in the hymns that you choose. So perhaps you may not know the hymns which are traditionally sung at weddings, but perhaps go back to your school days, that you and your friends, family and relatives are going to remember hymns from those times and experiences. And this is one of those hymns. I remember singing it all the way through primary school and maybe even into high school. And of course we sing it in church. And it's a hymn that talks about taking things step by step through the good and the bad as we travel through the world. but through the world we take God with us. And it is, of course, the hymn, without any further ado, of course, one more step along the world I go. Our final hymn in our bronze section, so this is our joint thirds, is a hymn which is a paraphrase, and it was sang at the wedding of Janet and Joe that we've mentioned earlier, Janet and Joe Young, on the 25th of June 1965 at North Motherwell Parish Church. In fact, it's just dawned on me that we have a doubler. Alan and Lynn Swan and Janet and Joe Young. Both couples were married on the 25th of June, just a couple of decades apart. And the hymn was also sang at the wedding of Alexa and Bobby Walker, right here in what was then known as MacDonald Memorial Church. It is the hymn, O God of Bethel, by whose hand thy people still are fed. folks, we are at our silver medalist section, and there are 2 hymns in this section. The first of these hymns is the hymn, O Father All Creating, to the tune of Aurelia, which we sing to the church's one foundation. And it was sung at the wedding of Alexa and Bobby Walker in April 1965, here in this building when it was MacDonald Memorial, and conducting that service was the Reverend Thompson, whose name is actually behind me on the memorial, on the pulpit. It was also sang at the wedding of Stanley and June Cook, who were married on the 3rd of June 1967. Again, right here, when this building was known as MacDonald Memorial Church, and again, that wedding was conducted by Mr. Thompson. It was also the hymn sang at Sheena and John Bowman's wedding. And last but not least, it was sang at the wedding of Ian and Margaret Douglas. So, sit back and have a good reminisce, those of you who had the hymn at your wedding, of O Father All Creating. here is the second hymn that's in our silver medalist spot. The hymn was sang at the weddings of Mary and Jim Matthew, Elspeth and John Dornan, Elaine and Jim Rennick, and Megan and John Fraser. Now, Megan and John were married here as Bellshill Central on the 2nd of November 2019, and that service was conducted by the Reverend Kevin De Beer. And the hymn is the 23rd Psalm, the metrical version of it. The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. And I know that for at least 3 of those weddings, because the first one was my mum and dad's, the second one I played at, in fact the third one I played at, and the fourth one I didn't, but I'm going to make the assumption we all sang it to the tune of Crimond. So here we have the second of our silver medalist spots, The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want, to the tune of Crimond. Now, before we get to the gold medal spot, I'm going to have a little bit of organist humour with you. And this only worked when we had weddings, which I call church weddings. And the folks that were getting married knew the hymns that we sang in church. So, if someone was having difficulty choosing hymns, and I didn't come up with this, it was someone else that told me, but it stuck in my head. So, as I say, the hymn book that I used for lots of these weddings, and most of the organists that would have played at them would have used, is CH3, sorry. And if we find it 442, and apologies for getting mixed up, but there's lots of fours in this section, it's the hymn by John Samuel Bewley Monsell, and it's to the tune of Duke Street. And this is the organist's humour. So, as a second hymn on the way out, or it could be the first one, it really made no difference. I would suggest that if they didn't know what they wanted, that they could perhaps have CH3 number 442, which is obviously tongue-in-cheek, because the first words are, fight the good fight. And of course, marriages and relationships don't have any fights, maybe ups and downs. But I just always thought that this was quite funny and a little bit of organist humour. So fight the good fight, run the straight race, cast care aside, and then this last one I always found funny. Faint not, nor fear. His arm is near, as in God's hand is near. So sit back and relax and enjoy a little interlude for one of the first of the organist jokes of wedding hymns. Fight the good fight. Continuing in a little bit of organist humour, and I think this would possibly be the first hymn if I were to place them first and second in a wedding ceremony. So as you know, in a wedding ceremony, usually the bride comes when the service is due to begin. Sometimes they're even a little bit late. So the groom and the best man are here early, sometimes through in the vestry, sometimes chatting with the guests as they arrive. However, they're always up on the chancel, waiting on the bride coming. And I can only imagine what that must feel like for a bridegroom, to be standing there and waiting, and also waiting for the da 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 da. I told you about cold feet when a bride did it. So his heart must be going 10 to the dozen. And I always used to laugh and joke that, well, if you don't know what hymn to have, how about CH3 number 484? Both the words and the tune are ideally suited to your possible state of mind that particular moment. So for those of you who have thumbed through your CH3s, you know what's coming. It's courage, brother, do not stumble, which always finishes with trust in God and do the right. So the second bit of some organist humour is courage, brother, do not stumble. Now, before we get to our gold spot, and I know you're all waiting, we're going to hear a piece of music called Perhaps Love. And this featured here at Bellshill Central on the 6th of April 2021. And it was a wedding with a difference. It was a wedding that had been, I think, postponed, but then rearranged. And then it couldn't happen the way that it had been planned for. And that's because it happened during COVID. So Hugh and Nikki, or to give her a full name, Riris, were married here at Bellshill Central by Reverend Kevin. And it was a wedding with 5 people, well, 6 if you include the photographer, in attendance. There was the minister, there was Hugh the groom, Nicky, sorry, give you your full name, Reris, the bride. There was myself playing the organ, there was Stanley Cook as session clerk, and both of us counted as witnesses also, and the photographer upstairs in the balcony. And during that wedding, as we signed the schedule and just thought about what was a perfect day, we have the piece of music that Reris and Hugh chose. And it's perhaps Love. And it's a beautiful piece of music and sounds lovely on our organ with some lovely fluty stops sounding. So enjoy Perhaps Love. And thanks to Hugh and Reris, aka Nicky, for including that in your wedding day.
Now the drum rolls. Nope, not yet. We're still meandering until we get to the gold place, first place. There are some hymns which are common at weddings, but again we ask people, choose a hymn or songs that you're going to know, you're going to feel part of, and so is the people in the pews. So I have played at lots of weddings in the past 31 years, and here are just two which weren't in the list but should be included. So, Give Me Oil in My Lamp, Keep Me Burning is a hymn which people are going to know from school, Sunday school, and everybody's going to get involved in, and it's happy and clappy and you can make plenty of noise. So that's the first one that we're going to have, and then we're going to segue into Lord, the light of your love is shining. Shine, Jesus, shine. Again, something from school perhaps, Sunday school, and a hymn which people are going to pick up. And it's a reminder that the Lord's light shines as love in our lives, and it should blaze within our heart and flow through as like a river. So again, very suited to weddings. So we have Give Me Oil in My Lamp, Keep Me Burning, and Lord, the light of your love is shining.
you've reached it. So, gold spot. It goes to the following couples who had it at their wedding. It was sang at the wedding of my mum and dad, Mary and Jim Matthew, on the 21st of April 1976, at a wedding in Chalmers Church of Scotland in Wishaw, conducted by the Reverend George Griffith. It was also sang at the wedding of my late cousin and her husband Jim, so Elaine and Jim Rennick. And that was the first time I actually played the organ at a service, on the 16th of June 1994. And again, that was in Chalmers Church of Scotland, Wishaw, but this time it was conducted by the Reverend Ian Coltart. It was sung at the wedding of Elspeth and John Dornan on the 18th of June 1980 at New Monkland Parish Church by the Reverend Alan Ford. It was sung at the wedding of Hugh and Reris, aka Nicky, on the 6th of April 2021, right here. Well, actually, it wasn't sung here. We had a little virtual choir going during COVID, and the virtual choir got together with their devices, like what I'm recording on, and all recorded their parts, sent them to me. I kind of stitched it all together, and it played on the screen, and we were treated to singing, because we weren't allowed to sing during COVID, by our virtual choir. And last but not least, it was sung at the wedding of Peggy, well, Sunday name is Margaret, isn't it? And Neil Walker in 1969 at Calder Bank Parish Church of Scotland. It's a hymn which isn't in our hymn book anymore, and it's a hymn of its time. It was a hymn that I think was probably sung at most weddings. And for those of you who we've chatted, you've tried to rack your brains, some of you, to try and remember what your wedding hymns were. As I said today at church to someone, your wedding day should be a day that stays with you all your days. It's either imprinted in your mind, or you've just chosen to forget it. But it's the hymn, "O Perfect Love." And I know that somebody sitting listening to it is going to be crying, because whenever she hears it, she cries. And it's not tears of, oh no, it's tears of joy, taking her back to a special day in her life. So I'm sure for everybody tonight, whether your hymns came at gold spots at O Perfect Love, or it's been joint fourth among 7 with perhaps All Things Bright and Beautiful, it hopefully has transported you back to your wedding day. So without any further ado, let us introduce ourselves to our top hymn in this selection, O Perfect Love. Well, folks, this has actually been a bit of a marathon. I recorded some of these hymns the other day. It was a lovely, beautiful day, so apologies, my legs have been out for some of these hymns. And that was about 50 minutes worth of music. I've recorded another half hour of music today, and looking at the timestamp on this camera, I have been gibbering away for about half an hour. So let's cut out the breaks in between and maybe a couple of bum notes. This is probably another 45 minutes added to about 50. So this has been a bumper edition, hasn't it? But I do hope you've stuck with us, and if you haven't, you've pressed the pause button and you've come back, and that we have transported you back to your wedding day, or a wedding that you've been at. We couldn't finish with any other piece of music other than the wedding march from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And as an organist, you never get to play it all, because folk want to run out to see the bride and groom, snap their pictures, throw their confetti. I even remember back in the day the kids would get a scramble. But it's a gorgeous piece of music with a middle section that probably most folk have left the building, even if the organist decides to play it. And it's got some lovely trills at the end, just giving it a lovely final flourish. It's a joyous, uplifting, happy piece of music, which countless numbers of couples have ended their wedding service with. So here we have, from A Midsummer Night's Dream, the Wedding March.
don't know about you, but I am bushed. I'm going to sit back and put my feet up, and at the time of recording, I've still got the video to finish, so I'm definitely due a wee break. However, it's been a pleasure to speak to people, figure out what their wedding hymns were, and even seeing the faces going, what did we sing at the wedding? I'm not sure when the next Organist Entertains will come to you, but we will have another one, and if you want to request something, just pop a message along to the usual email addresses, organist@bellshillcentral.church. If you come to church, have a word with me. What we're doing at church just now is having a little fundraiser. So if any of you guys would like to participate in that, you're more than welcome to do so. People are requesting hymns or pieces of music and donating something for church funds. I think we might have raised about £200 so far. It comes in little dribs and drabs, but I've seen some 20s, 10s, 5ers coming in, so I think we might be at 200. So if you'd like to request a hymn and contribute to the ongoing fundraising for our church, you would be more than welcome to do so. So I think how we always used to finish these was stay safe, stay calm, and stay singing. Or if it wasn't that, it was something similar, but the sentiment is the same. So take care, everybody. We'll meet soon this year for another online Organist Entertains, and good night.